Bobby Driscoll was a bright young child star for Disney until he was ultimately terminated by the company simply for becoming a teenager with acne. He died a tragic death and is remembered today as a sad story of loss and drug addiction. Stay tuned as Facts First presents Bobby Driscoll's cause of death was utterly tragic. Bobby Driscoll got his start in the business at age 5, but it wasn't because he was chasing a dream, it was simply on advice of a local barber. He was in Pasadena, California and getting his hair cut when the barber commented he had a look that would be perfect for movies. What Bobby and his parents didn't realize was that the barber's son was already in the acting world and had an agent. He introduced Bobby to the boy's agent, and the agent took Bobby on. He managed to help him land a role very quickly. It was a small part, but a great introduction to the business for the young boy. Bobby's role was in the movie Lost Angel from 1943 that starred Margaret O'Brien. It may have been a bit part, but it led to parts in 9 different movies in the next 3 years. One of those was called So Goes My Love, and it starred Don Amici and Myrna Loy. Not only did it give Bobby a chance to cut his chops, but it was also a gig that impressed his co-stars. Don Amici talked about the fact that he'd worked with a lot of young stars in his career, but that of all of them, he thought Bobby had the brightest future. Song of the South. That prediction seemed to begin coming true when Bobby landed a role in the major hit movie Song of the South in 1946. He was 9 at the time, and this was by far his biggest project so far. The movie was ahead of its time in many ways, as it blended live action with animation. Bobby played Johnny, a child visiting his grandpa at his plantation. The movie was set in the southern U.S. during the era of Reconstruction. Almost immediately, there was a backlash against it and its whitewashing of slavery. It also relied upon some pretty horrible racial stereotypes. These days, it's no longer considered an important or good film because of those elements, but at the time, it did well. And that was enough to make it a big step in Bobby's career. He was offered a contract with the newly established Walt Disney Productions, becoming the first person to do so. Disney himself was quite fond of Bobby's talent and kept utilizing him in more movies. These included So Dear to My Heart in 1948, as well as Melody Time that same year. And the production team at Disney certainly wanted to make sure their initial investment in Bobby panned out. They closely supervised many aspects of his life. According to Bobby's mom, the workers weren't allowed to swear in front of him, though that isn't that crazy considering he was 9. Walt apparently saw Bobby as the classic all-American kid and felt as such he'd have a long career as a child actor and potentially more. Award success. Bobby's early success wasn't limited to musical and animated fare, however. Disney allowed him to be borrowed for the movie The Window in 1949. It was made by RKO Pictures, who perhaps saw the same potential in Bobby that Walt Disney did. The movie was a thriller, and young Bobby's character witnesses a murder. His performance was lauded by critics and fans alike. Even the New York Times wrote that his work in the film was brilliant, adding that there was, quote, an acute expression of peril etched on the boy's face and reflected by his every movement as he flees death. Back in the day, the Oscars had an award for child actors, known as the Juvenile Award. It was given to performers under 18 for their work in general, not for any specific role. But after seeing Bobby's performance in The Window, the Academy deemed him worthy of the award. The excited young boy was effusive in his acceptance speech, thanking God and his wonderful parents. The early 1950s. The early 50s saw Bobby's career really start to take off. He was still a cute and talented young kid with a lot of burgeoning star power. He signed on to the Disney movie Treasure Island in 1950, a live-action adaptation of the famous Robert Louis Stevenson novel. As the lead in the film, Bobby carried it quite well, putting his skills to the test as main character Jim Hawkins. Jim is on a hunt for buried treasure when he has run-ins with local pirates. Of course, as tends to happen when you've had a string of great reviews, there were some critics who didn't think Bobby nailed the part. But that was mostly because he was the sole American in a cast full of Brits. At the same time, the New York Times was floored by his performance. And clearly Disney was impressed since they asked him to return to the role the next year in a radio adaptation. But the biggest role of his career came off the back of these performances. Oddly enough, it was one that didn't see Bobby performing on screen. Instead, he served as the voice for the animated feature Peter Pan. This was in 1953 when Bobby was 16. It was notable because prior to the film, Peter Pan had always been played by women. Bobby worked opposite Catherine Beaumont, who provided the voice for Wendy. Together, they recorded in an empty soundstage where Disney not only recorded their voices for the part, but also their movements. They choreographed much of the animation around the way Bobby and Catherine moved in the soundstage. Not only was Peter Pan well received by critics and audiences alike, it managed to become the highest-grossing film of 1953. Disney capitalized on this by inviting the cast to perform it in a live-action radio setting. The film has since become a Disney classic, having been re-released 8 different times over the years in theaters. The beginning of the end. While you might assume Bobby's success would have propelled him to further stardom, that couldn't be further from the truth. He had managed to make the transition from a child actor to a teenaged actor and was finding his biggest success to date. And yet, the challenges of puberty ended up wreaking havoc on Bobby's career. He suffered from a lot of acne in his teen years. This, of course, is an ailment incredibly common to teenagers, but it can become an issue for teens trying to constantly be on camera. When he would act, the makeup department would have to use a lot of makeup to cover it up. But the acne, combined with his general changing face as it went through puberty, apparently turned off the execs at Walt Disney. They felt he no longer had the boyish charm and looks that made him so successful. And despite it being no fault of his own, Bobby lost favor with the folks at Disney. There was another factor that had nothing to do with him that contributed. At the time, RKO Pictures had begun distributing all of Disney's movies, and the certifiably crazy Howard Hughes had recently purchased RKO. Hughes, among his many idiosyncrasies, didn't like the idea of having children on the payroll, which of course is a fairly ridiculous thing if you're distributing Disney films. But as the owner, he was entitled to make those kinds of changes. The end result was Disney dropped Bobby from his contract a full 3 years before it was set to expire, and they didn't have the courtesy to even let him know. One day he tried to enter the studio lot to go to work, and they wouldn't let him in. He tried to sign with other studios in town, but his status as a Disney star somehow meant other studios didn't take him seriously. Bobby's downfall. The career fall had devastating effects on Bobby's emotional state. He was utterly devastated and felt as if Hollywood had thrown him away like garbage. He'd been receiving schooling at Hollywood Professional School with other child actors, but his parents enrolled him in local public school. His status as a former actor and being a new kid made him a target of bullies. And according to Bobby, his only recourse was to fight back. As such, he became, quote, belligerent and cocky and was afraid all the time. Eventually, he was able to persuade his parents to let him leave public school and re-enroll at Hollywood Professional School. But by then, he had already begun experimenting with drugs, which eventually led to his downfall. His late career and death. Bobby was able to get occasional roles in the next several years, but his drug addiction quickly overtook him. Any money he'd make from acting would immediately go towards his drug habit. His mother said in an interview he completely stopped caring about how he looked, and his hygiene disappeared. Soon his acting roles dried up, and he began resorting to crime. He was arrested for a variety of felonies, garnering a solid criminal record. He spent some time in rehab before moving to New York to try stage acting, but that didn't yield much success. Sadly, in 1968, Bobby's body was found in an abandoned apartment building in Greenwich Village, having died of heart failure. The signs all pointed to it coming as a result of heroin addiction. The tolls of failed stardom and drug addiction had finally taken their toll. Now it's time to hear from you. Do you remember young Bobby Driscoll from his Disney days? Let us know in the comments section below.